Secretary of State, Dean Rusk. They would tell him, look, we're looking for somebody to help us overthrow Fidel. We don't have anybody, but we should make plans in case we find somebody so we can take advantage. So all through the summer and fall of '63, Dean Rusk and McNamara, the Secretary of the Army, Cyrus Vance, Vance's aides, Joseph Califano and Alexander Haig, all these people, they were making all these plans for what to do if the Kennedys found somebody to stage a coup. Well, the Kennedys had the person, and they'd had him since May, Commander Almeida, but you couldn't tell the Secretary of State that because the Secretary of State's meeting with reporters every day. Secretary of State has a huge bureaucracy. He has all these aides, all these secretaries, as they were called in those days. So the Bay of Pigs failed partially because it was such a big open secret. So the Kennedys were determined not to make that mistake again. And they knew they had to take some action against Cuba. You may be asking yourself, well, why take this crazy chance? Why bother? Well, here's why. Now, raise your hand if you've heard that to end the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK promised not to invade Cuba. In other words, if the Russians would withdraw the missiles and not bring them in, that JFK would agree not to invade Cuba. Has anyone heard that? Okay, I see some hands and nods. Okay, and if that's the conventional history you will read in history books today.
Well, and the missiles in Turkey.
Well, and there was a side deal with missiles in Turkey, but that was kind of secret at the time. Well, and again, this is kind of an amazing thing. You can go back and look in the newspapers and listen to the speeches, and it's just, no, that's not true. Part of the deal was that JFK made the deal with the head of Russia, Nikita Khrushchev. Part of their deal was that Fidel Castro had to allow UN inspections for weapons of mass destruction in Cuba, just to guarantee all the missiles were gone. Because JFK wasn't going to take Fidel's word for it. And so JFK agreed, Nikita Khrushchev, head of Russia, agreed. Fidel Castro, he said, no way. I'm not allowing UN inspections for weapons of mass destruction in my country. And by the way, JFK was the first U.S. president to use those terms. He used them in speeches. So the no invasion pledge only took effect when there were those UN weapons inspections. Fidel wouldn't allow them. So as far as JFK and his government were concerned, there was no deal. Now, a lot of people thought there was a deal, and JFK, the Russians would keep asking, and JFK would kind of put them off. So you couldn't just stage a full-out invasion of Cuba. I mean, that would look bad anyway. America doesn't do that sort of thing. So it had to be, as thousands of pages of documents now describe, it had to appear to be a palace coup, as if it were sheerly an internal matter. Commander Almeida was not going to take credit for killing Fidel. Why would the people of Cuba, whom the CIA admitted largely supported Fidel, rally around the man who killed their beloved leader? That wouldn't happen. No, Commander Almeida was, and the people working with him, were going to apparently, according to CIA files, blame Castro's death on a Russian or a Russian sympathizer. There were thousands of Russian troops still in Cuba. Hopefully the missiles were gone. But there were thousands of troops. What a great way to neutralize all those troops. So it would look as if Fidel had been killed while riding in an open jeep by a couple of riflemen. Fidel would drive to his beach house in an open jeep every weekend on the beach house in Veradero Beach. And Fidel at that time would stay away from limousines and stuff, wanted to show he was a man of the people. So he would drive or be driven in an open jeep. So that was the one time you could get around his heavy security. And so on December 1st, 1963, he was supposed to be shot in the open jeep by a couple of riflemen. Commander Almeida, as head of the Cuban army, would blame the assassination on a Russian or a Russian sympathizer and say, look, the Russians have killed our beloved Fidel. We don't want the Russians to come in here and take over. And Almeida would invite U.S. troops in to help prevent a Soviet takeover. But the Kennedys were smart. You wouldn't want a bunch of crew-cut white U.S. Marines be the first troops into Cuba. So the Kennedys had even trained a special unit of Cuban-American veterans from the Bay of Pigs, people from Cuba, had joined the U.S. Army, and they were trained and ready at Fort Benning, Georgia. And they would be the first troops in. Harry Williams and 4 other Cuban exiles working for the Kennedys would also go in. They would form a coalition government with Commander Almeida. And again, the documents are just amazing. You won't believe the thousands of pages that say exactly who would get what cabinet position. There would be eventual free elections under the auspices of the OAS, Organization of American States. I mean, they had everything planned out, and it would lead to eventual freedom and democracy. And so this was all secret. And when I say secret, I mean most historians and journalists didn't know this until 2 years ago in Ultimate Sacrifice. I mean, this was buried that deep, and here's why. It was never supposed to be known that the coup was the brainchild of John and Robert Kennedy. Not the next year, not in 10 years, not in 30 years, because, of course, that would delegitimize whatever post-coup government there was in Cuba. So it was always supposed to, appear to have been an internal quote from the documents, palace coup. And JFK would just look as if he had responded well to an unexpected opportunity, And as for why JFK felt he had to do that, if you go back and look in the newspapers, and newspapers, by the way, in microfilm can be a great way to learn history, which has been changed over the years. I mean, if you go back and look in the newspapers, you'll see that what we call the Great Depression used to be called, the Republican Depression. And along about 1948, for that election with Truman, where everybody thought he was going to lose, a lot of the newspapers, and certainly the Republicans, just decided to change that name. Republican Depression was kind of a millstone around their neck, So they just, we'll start calling it the Great Depression. And they did, and it stuck, So, but like I say, so you can go back and look at newspapers, and in those newspapers you will see that John F. Kennedy's opponents, prospective opponents in the 1964 election, were already starting to beat him up over Cuba. They knew about that, the pledge and the UN weapons inspection stuff, because that had actually been in some speeches and newspaper articles. And they were saying, well, how do we know all the missiles are gone? How do we know the Soviets didn't put them back? Look at JFK letting this dictator be 90 miles from the U.S. And this was constant. And this was before the 64. I mean, this was in late 63. 64 wasn't even here yet. And so JFK was told by all his advisors, look, this is going to be a big problem for us. They're going to go after you on the Bay of Pigs. They're going to go after you for not following through on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you'll get some right-wing, hawk Republican saying, well, I'll go in and just take out Fidel. And then who knows? If there are missiles in Cuba, then it'll be World War III. So, as we were told by several Kennedy associates, JFK felt he had to take some sort of action against Cuba before the end of 63 to prevent it from becoming, quote, a political football in the 64 election. Now, to give JFK credit, he did try twice very hard in the fall of 63 to have a peaceful settlement and resolution. And they did 2 different, one was with a newswoman named Lisa Howard, another one with a French journalist named, I would pronounce it Jean Daniel, but I'm sure in France it's pronounced differently. So the Kennedys, and people have never understood, why Kennedy tried so hard in the fall of 63 to get some sort of a back-channel peace settlement. That's why. If they could have gotten that, that would have been preferable. But that hadn't come through. So the coup looked like it was going to happen. Now, Bobby was worried about what would happen if Fidel found out about this coup and decided to retaliate. And they looked at all sorts of retaliation, including sabotaging of aircraft. What if the Cubans try to sabotage an aircraft or crash an airliner? Or what if the Cubans find out about the coup plan and they try to, this is a quote, assassinate an American official?
Well, that's in Northwoods, though.
Well, this is after Northwoods. This is in 63. So, in other words, and by the way, what Northwoods is, right, just so you guys know, the Department of Defense, and I was responsible for those documents getting released.
Oh, so you gave them to Bamford?
Well, no. I told them to the review board, and then the review board released them, and Bamford got them from the review board. So, but no, our own Defense Department had looked at ways to provoke a war with Cuba in 62 by staging phony things, but the Kennedys wouldn't go for that. So by 63, the Kennedys had their own man in charge as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Maxwell Taylor. The Kennedys trusted him so much, Bobby Kennedy named one of his sons after Maxwell Taylor. The Kennedys also trusted the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, kind of the CIA for the military, who was headed by General Joseph Carroll, who's the father of the great writer James Carroll up in Boston. So it was very different military in 63 than it had been in some ways in 62 and in 61 for the Bay of Pigs. So the Kennedys actually trusted a lot of the military. They didn't trust Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis Baum back to the Stone Age LeMay, but they pretty much trusted a lot of the other people. So Bobby was worried. So what if the Cubans find out and they try to do something to us? How can we